What do Xenoblade, Lunar, Rune Factory, the Soul Blazer trilogy, and the Atelier series have in common besides the fact that they are all JRPGs? Instrumental figures responsible for the creation of many of these games got their start at one company. A company created by a man passionate about Star Wars that took its naming inspiration from the Millennium Falcon. In March of 1981, former computer engineer Masayuki Kato created Nihon Falcom Corporation, a company that would go on to practically invent the action RPG and JRPG genres and survive far longer than bigger companies with more successful games have. A company that has proven that, even in this age of inflated budget games where millions of dollars in development time and human resources are sunk into photorealistic 60 frame per second experiences, you can still make a good RPG on a semi-indie budget with a smaller elite staff and a fraction of the time. Nihon Falcom has created more than RPGs, but RPGs will be the primary focus of this video. In 1983, Yoshio Kiya created Falcom's first RPG, Panorama To, which translates to Panorama Island. As you can see, this game is extraordinarily abstract in its design, but its user interface is actually quite rich. There are first-person dungeons with accompanying maps, there's the world map and a small window in the lower right to illustrate combat. There's no background music, and I'll spare you the loud beeps that make up its sound effects. There is also a window in the bottom center that displays the player's power, weapon, and other stats. The game has settlements to rest and recuperate too, but my favorite thing has got to be the in-game character art that looks a lot like ASCII art. Despite Panorama To's diverse gameplay, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a JRPG, nor anything groundbreaking to the RPG genre as a whole when wizardry had already been a thing since 1981. But its creator, Yoshio Kato, did go on to create Dragon Slayer in 1983, and that game became the template from which many future action RPGs followed. Many people even consider this game the first action JRPG, but I'll leave other people to make or dispute that argument. In any case, its sequel, Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, or just plain Xanadu, released in 1985 just 1 year before Dragon Quest, sold 400,000 copies on PC, making it the best-selling PC game ever made at the time. The Dragon Slayer games added RPG progression systems to a classic real-time action arcade style with fully featured statistics, a karma meter, and experience points for equipped items. Equipment changed the player's appearance, and there was also a food meter. Even here in 2024, many games still won't change the character's appearance with equipment changes. Xanadu in particular added background music to the beeps and blips that made up the prior game's soundtrack. Dragon Slayer, and more prominently its Xanadu spin-off, are still flagship franchises of Falcom to this day. Unfortunately, there are no official localizations of these games into English. However, there are fan translations for several versions of the games. If you're like me, you're probably wondering why a Japanese game company this popular in the 80s wasn't talked about as much as its main rivals, Square and Enix, were. And that's because Falcom was primarily a PC developer during the time when consoles like Nintendo and later the Sega family were becoming increasingly popular. Enix and Square also published their most popular games in the West, while Xanadu has never gotten a Western localization, and the difficulty involved in subtitling a Japanese voice track in 1985 when games weren't designed to consider localizations has kept the game from even getting an English fan translation up to today. It wasn't until 1986 that North America saw their first Falcom game, Tombs and Treasures, but Falcom's first internationally released action RPG, Ys 1 Ancient Ys Vanished Omens, released on the Sega Master System to glowing reviews. It cultivated the beginning of a long, fond relationship to the series and protagonist Adol Christin for the few fans in the West that got to play it. Ys 1 has a top-down view and highly accessible bump attack system that punished direct attacks but rewarded clipping enemies or bumping them from the side or back. Falcom likened the battle system's fun to the fun of popping bubbles in bubble wrap. The tactics involved with effective bumping gave the game a sort of high score system that alleviated some of the tedium of level grinding. Players could also recharge health over time, so there was very little break in the action. It's really difficult to describe in words how this is fun, but trust me, even today it's actually a very quick and fluid battle system. I played Ys 1 and 2 for the first time in the late 2010s, long after playing many more modern Ys games before them, and after appropriately lowering my expectations, I found myself enjoying the games a lot more than I thought I would. This is largely due to the game's decent storytelling and the fact that I never really had to break the game's pacing to go into menus to recover or fight individual enemies for too long, since they'd all go down with a few well-placed bumps. The games definitely weren't the best action RPGs I've ever played, but I was surprised how well their gameplay held up considering their age. They were easy games to play, but not completely mindless, as a few bad bumps could quickly ruin your progression rhythm. I could understand how these games would be popular in the 80s. One other thing that was really special about Ys was its soundtrack. The beeps and bloops were gone and replaced by rich melodies composed by Yuzo Koshiro and Mieko Ishikawa. The soundtrack to Ys is so good it is considered one of the most influential RPG scores of all time, and even if Yuzo Koshiro isn't doing the soundtrack to Ys games anymore, Falcom's sound team continues the tradition of producing great audio for its games to this day. The Sega Master System version of Ys received high scores. It was compared favorably to The Legend of Zelda for its superior graphics. There are many versions of Ys among consoles and PC with small differences. Some versions have extra songs or some extra scenes. After Ys 3, the series creators Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki formed their own game company Quintet and went on to create the amazing ActRaiser games, the Soul Blazer trilogy, and Robotrek. Yuzo Koshiro also formed his own music company with his family and produced music for Quintet. Meanwhile, over the past 37 years, Falcom has continued to produce Ys games, and Ys 10 Nordics is scheduled to release in the West later in 2024. Each game is standalone and features Adol Christin on a brand new action RPG adventure with mostly new action RPG gameplay, but fans of the series can place the games on a timeline that's much cleaner than the one Nintendo painted for the Legend of Zelda series. The Ys series is an important flagship series for Falcom, but Falcom's story doesn't end there. In 1989, the sixth game in the Dragon Slayer series, Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes, spawned a new franchise for Falcom that became known as Legend of Heroes. The Legend of Heroes series are turn-based JRPGs that consist of three sub-series. The first is the Dragon Slayer sub-series, consisting of Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes and Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes 2. Only the second game has no official nor fan translation in English. The second Legend of Heroes sub-series is known as the Gagarv Trilogy and consists of The Legend of Heroes 2, Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch, The Legend of Heroes, A Tear of Vermilion, and The Legend of Heroes 3, Song of the Ocean. All of these games except The Legend of Heroes 2, Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch have official Western localizations, but a fan translation of Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch has been in the works since 2023, so it might eventually be possible to play the game in English. And finally, there's the Monumental Trails, or Kiseki sub-series of the Legend of Heroes series, which have become Falcom's most ambitious flagship turn-based RPG series for the past 2 decades. I won't read off every game in this series, but it's split into arcs with a few one-off games that tell stories in different regions of the world's Zemurian continent. Trails in the Sky was first with 3 games from 2004 to 2007. The Crossbell duology games were released in 2010 and 2011. The Erebonian quadrilogy was released between 2013 and 2018. Trails into Reverie tied up loose ends in Erebonia and Crossbell in 2020. Falcom is now telling the story of Kalvar, with 2 games released in Japan and a third one set to release over there before the end of the year. There's also an action RPG called The Legend of Nayuta: Boundless Trails, which may or may not be related to the other Trails games. And although it's more of a fan game, Falcom also made Ys vs. Trails in the Sky on the PSP, which is a crossover single or multiplayer fighting game between Ys and Trails characters in a top-down style. The game was never officially localized, but it does have a fan translation and can be enjoyed through emulation if that doesn't offend you. Every Trails game has been officially translated into English and is available on PC or various consoles except for the Calvard games, of which only the first game has been announced for localization by Nipponichi Software America for release in July of 2024. The third game in the Calvard trilogy is expected to release in Japan before the end of the year. The Trails games were far behind their Japanese release dates for a long time, and the localization of the entire series has had an amazing history with a fair bit of drama spanning multiple localization companies and fan translators over the past 13 years. I definitely encourage you to look up the history of Trails localizations if you're interested in learning about it, but I won't be talking about it in this video. Many games in this series have also been improved upon with better user experience features and ported to other platforms in fresh releases too. The Trails series has had plenty of other spin-offs. The Legend of Heroes: Trails at Sunrise is a Japanese-only gacha game released in 2016. A 2-part Trails in the Sky second chapter anime OVA series was produced in 2011 and 2012 and released in North America too. Most recently, in early 2023, 12 episodes of The Legend of Heroes: Trails of Cold Steel, Northern War were released, telling the story of events that occur between the 3rd and 4th Trails of Cold Steel games. A mobile game of the same name was released in Japan in 2023 and is set to release in the West on May 29, 2024. Trails in the Sky received a novelization. Trails in the Sky Gaiden, The Tale of Lo, and The Legend of Heroes: Trails from Zero, Pre-Story, The Ring of Judgment are original manga stories that tell the stories of other characters that aren't as detailed in the games. A comedy manga serialized in monthly Falcom magazine called Minna Atsumare Falcom Gakuen featured many Falcom characters, including those from Trails, and also got 2 short anime adaptations. And that's not all. Audio drama adaptations were also produced to fill in some details between games. XC translated 2 of these transcripts and provided them freely for marketing material promoting Trails of Cold Steel 2. A 2.5D musical, or anime musical, for Trails of Cold Steel also ran in Japan in January 2017. Prometheum Books is designing the tabletop RPGs Ys Age of Heroes and The Legend of Heroes Trails of Destiny that are set to release sometime in 2024, and will probably be the first Falcom-related products to ever see an English release before a Japanese one. Needless to say, the Trails JRPGs series is huge. While the games don't sell like most RPG flagships from bigger companies, they have an incredibly passionate and dedicated community that's allowed the series to continue for over 11 games, making it the longest series of JRPG games that feature the same characters, the same world, and the same history. However, this unique quality and its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. There's a reason most JRPG franchises don't make sequels for their subsequent games. They scare away newcomers to the series who haven't played the first game. Just for some context behind my biases in this video, so you know where I'm coming from, I personally didn't become a big fan of Nihon Falcom's games until their first Trails game in the Legend of Heroes series, Trails in the Sky. While the original game released in Japan in 2004 on PC, I didn't get to play this game until 2011 on the PSP, since that was when the game got an official Western localization. Around 2010 is also when many of Falcom's non-Ys games finally started getting more English localizations in general. Even 7 years after its original PC release, Trails in the Sky was a very good game on the PSP, and its follow-up was an excellent game. Somehow, I actually managed to never rent a Falcom game from Blockbuster Video despite renting out most of their entire collection for the NES and SNES over the years. My first Ys game was actually Ys 7 on the PSP, which was recommended to me by a fellow friend who was streaming with me on Justin.tv. And that game rocked so hard I ended up going back and playing all the previous Ys games and every Ys game that had come out since. My current favorite Ys game is Ys Oath in Felghana, which is a remake of the third Ys game. Someday I'd love to play through the original Dragon Slayer just to experience the game so important to modern action RPGs, if I could figure out any good way to do it. I adore the Trail series, but I can't help but wonder how much more popular Falcom would be these days if their most popular pioneering earlier games, like the original Dragon Slayer and Xanadu, had more Western exposure in the 80s like the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy series got. In that respect, I think Falcom's reputation is similar to Atlus's reputation before they actually got to release a flagship Megami Tensei title west. The Trails series and the Ys games definitely have their dedicated fans, but Trails in particular sort of gatekeeps itself from new players due to how its 10 plus games build off of each other to the point where newcomers playing the newest games in the series won't be as excited about returning characters and stories since they don't know these people or events from past games. Also, understandably, players don't want to start a long series of games with a game that's 2 decades old and missing a lot of the great user experience features in modern Trails games. If a player isn't starting the Trails series, at least at the beginning of an arc, they'll definitely miss out on context. I enjoy Falcom's games, but it's true that their games are very indie in appearance, frequently reuse assets, and sometimes noticeably pad out their content far more than they should. When a game developer has only 62 developers and is producing games every year, this is an inevitable consequence. This is also why I say the series as a whole is far greater than any individual game, and there's not one game in the Trails series that would even make my top 20 list despite their fun factor for me. However, the fact that a team of some 62 odd developers can push out as much quality content as they do as quickly as they do with such a small team is a testament to their skills that have been developed over 40 plus years in the games industry. In the 6-year period it takes a developer to produce a huge game that might suck, Falcom will have released 6 decent quality games. Let that sink in. Falcom's passion for creating games and their devotion to continuing to create games for all of their series for the past 43 years has earned them a loyal fan base who's just as passionate about playing these games even when there are higher budget RPGs and action RPGs out there. In particular, Falcom has managed to do something with the Trails series that no other JRPG developer has managed to do. They've created the longest running series of related JRPGs ever. The only game series that even compares is Xenoblade Chronicles, and Tetsuya Takahashi failed before that with his ambitious Xenosaga series that had to end after the 3rd game instead of the 6th. I think Falcom was able to do this because of their loyal fan base who will purchase anything they produce, but it's not just that. The Trails games have many unsolved mysteries that keep players coming back to new games to learn more about what's going on. Each subsequent game answers questions and poses more, introducing new characters, organizations, and relevant history to the plot. Over the years and across multiple arcs spanning the Zemurian continent, Falcom manages to develop an interesting world players can look forward to revisiting with each new game. The games also feature in-game novels that tease future characters and locations in coming games, and when players might be getting getting tired of one group of protagonists, they shift and either change the setting, change the characters, or do both when they start a new arc. I have been gushing about Trails most of this video, but let's not forget Falcom's other action RPG IPs. Xanadu might be the oldest action RPG franchise that's still getting releases, beginning with Xanadu Dragon Slayer 2 in 1985, and most recently in 2015 with Tokyo Xanadu. Nihon Falcom has even been teasing what might be the next Xanadu game in production for release in 2025. The Yi series has been around since 1987 and is still getting new releases every few years. Even today, Nihon Falcom is still innovating the JRPG genre. Due to Metaphor ReFantasio's long development time, it's unclear who developed the battle system first, but it is clear that Falcom's Trails Through Daybreak released first with a, in my opinion, really fun hybrid action and turn-based battle system. Of course, Atlus is adding their own spin to their own version of the battle system with archetypes in what they dub as the fast and squad mode for Metaphor. But it worked really well in Trails Through Daybreak, and if Atlus can implement it even only as well as Falcom did, it will have a fun battle system. Nihon Falcom has not only contributed at a foundational level to the JRPG genre, but it also served as an unprecedented incubator for developer talent before the 21st century. I've already mentioned Yuzo Koshido and the developers at Quintet, but also Tetsuya Takahashi, the director for Xenogears at Square, founder of Monolith Soft, and the creator of the Xenoblade Chronicles series at Nintendo, began his career at Falcom working on the first Legend of Heroes game in 1989. By pure coincidence, the Legend of Heroes Trails series and Xenoblade series actually share some characteristics in how their games add more to their universes in each of their own series. Programmer Kazunori Tomi, who worked on the fifth game in the Dragon Slayer series, Sorcerian, among several other titles, went on to form Studio Alex, which co-developed the much-loved Lunar series of JRPGs with Game Arts in the late 1990s. Minako Iwasaki, who did character design work at Falcom for early games in the Ys and Legend of Heroes series, among others, became a freelance artist who does the character design work on the Rune Factory series of action RPG farm simulation games. Tadanobu Inoue, who wrote the first Xanadu game, went on to produce most of the Atelier series of alchemy puzzle JRPGs for over 2 decades and is still making Atelier games at Gust. It wasn't just amazing game developers that got their start at Falcom either. Perhaps the most internationally famous Nihon Falcom alumni is the anime director Makoto Shinkai, who did graphics and animations on Falcom's games for 5 years straight out of college. At Falcom, he also met the composer Tenmon, who worked as part of Falcom sound team JDK on games like Brandish, and became a frequent collaborator in Shinkai's films. Makoto Shinkai went on to produce many award-winning anime films, including Your Name, which would eventually overtake Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away and become the highest-grossing anime film of all time in 2019. Nihon Falcom still commands a lot of respect among its peer developers in Japan. Masahiro Sakurai, the creator of Kirby and developer of Smash Bros., has talked about Nihon Falcom multiple times in his videos on his YouTube channel. And while I know Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has enough sword users, I am still surprised that Adol Christin never even made it into the game as a spirit, considering his long history in gaming that practically parallels Link and Zelda. While the passion and heart that go into Nihon Falcom's games hasn't really changed since the company's founding in 1981, many other things have changed. In the 80s, Falcom was a leader and a trailblazer with its games that popularized PCs in Japan. The quality of their games in the 80s and early 90s compared to or exceeded what other game companies were doing at the time. However, these days, instead of spending more money to create bigger and better games, like most game companies tend to do, Falcom has a much leaner core team and more conservative budget they've adhered to for their productions. This semi-indie approach to game development is probably the biggest reason they've been able to continue to make games for over 40 years without threats of buyouts or bankruptcy. Rather than blow their load to try to produce the best games ever made, they produce really good games on a budget instead, and much faster than any other company easily could. Also, in Japan, Falcom both develops and publishes their own games, so they aren't under the kinds of pressure from publishers that often ruins games and companies. Due to Nihon Falcom's age as a company, they have a much farther reach, especially in Japan, when it comes to marketing their games than a young independent development company would. Localization is outsourced to companies in other regions, so it's not eating into their development budgets. Although they aren't under the umbrella of a publisher, Nihon Falcom is actually a publicly traded company in the Tokyo stock market, so they still have investors to appeal to. Masayuki Kato stepped down as Falcom's president to become their chairman in 2001 and is replaced by Shinji Yamazaki. Falcom's current president, Toshihiro Kondo, is a great example of the passion Falcom represents. He began as a web designer for an unofficial Falcom fan page in 1996 that became so popular the company was in communications with him. After Kondo graduated, he was hired at Falcom as a web designer, moving on to writing scenarios for the Legend of Heroes games, and then becoming a project manager for the company. In 2007, when Shinji Yamazaki had to step down for health reasons, Kato offered the presidency to Kondo. I could tell a similar story about fans who were so passionate about the Trails games that they fan translated the games and then got contacted to do official translations translations later. Nihon Falcom is just that rare semi-indie developer that fans gravitate toward, and they're a company that values their fans' passion too. I don't think Falcom is ever going to make a game that will wow the pants off of your average gamer, but their products remain cult favorites among many fans of JRPGs and niche gamers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.